The silver fork never reached the table. It froze halfway to his mouth as the man everyone believed was just another wealthy traveler sat perfectly still, staring at a piece of meat that should never have been served to anyone, let alone inside the most exclusive VIP lounge his company had spent decades building. He took one careful bite, and everything changed. The taste hit first, followed by a foul odor that should have been impossible to miss. The vegetables beside it had already begun to spoil. The sauce had separated from the meat, and the expensive wine poured moments earlier was warm enough to tell him that someone had stopped caring long before he walked through those doors. Around him, executives laughed over business deals, wealthy clients sipped coffee, and employees continued moving as if nothing unusual had happened. Nobody rushed over. Nobody apologized. Nobody even looked surprised. That silence told him something far worse than the meal ever could. This wasn't an accident. This was routine. In less than an hour, careers would end, reputations would collapse, and an investigation would uncover a culture of neglect so deeply rooted that even longtime employees had forgotten what excellence looked like. What began as one spoiled meal inside a luxury lounge would soon expose years of hidden failures that had been quietly damaging one of America's most respected hospitality brands, while everyone responsible believed the owner would never return without warning. They couldn't have imagined that the quiet man sitting alone in the corner wasn't simply another guest. He was the founder who had built the company from nothing, the man whose standards had once made the brand famous across the country, and the one person capable of seeing through every excuse before a single word had been spoken. He had arrived without an announcement, without security, without executives preparing the building for his visit. He wanted the same experience every paying guest received, and what he discovered would leave even seasoned investigators asking how such a respected company had been allowed to fall this far. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened next wasn't simply the story of a billionaire firing employees over one terrible meal. It became the story of how success can quietly erase accountability, how small compromises become accepted habits, and how one ordinary lunch would reveal years of decisions that should never have been ignored. Richard Lawson had spent more than 3 decades building a reputation that competitors admired and employees respected. Long before his company became one of America's fastest-growing luxury hospitality brands, he believed that success was never measured by elegant buildings or impressive financial reports. It was measured by the experience of the person walking through the front door. A guest could forgive a delayed reservation or a crowded lobby, but they would never forget being treated with care, honesty, and professionalism. Those principles transformed a small regional operation into a nationally recognized brand serving business executives, celebrities, politicians, and corporate leaders who expected nothing less than perfection every time they visited. Richard demanded high standards from everyone around him because he demanded even more from himself. He personally reviewed customer complaints, visited properties without cameras, remembered employees by name, and insisted that every location carrying his company's logo reflected the values on which it had been built. As the business expanded across the country, however, daily operations naturally shifted into the hands of regional executives and experienced managers. They assured him that every property continued operating at the same exceptional level that had made the company successful. Performance reports looked impressive. Customer satisfaction surveys appeared healthy. Financial statements exceeded expectations quarter after quarter. Everything suggested the business had never been stronger. Yet Richard had learned years earlier that numbers rarely tell the entire story. Reports can be edited. Statistics can be arranged to look encouraging. But the experience of an ordinary customer cannot be manipulated once they walk through the door. That belief stayed with him throughout his career, which was why he occasionally disappeared from the corporate office without informing anyone where he was going. Very few people knew he still enjoyed visiting company locations as quietly as he had done in the early years. Unlike scheduled executive tours that gave managers days to prepare, these surprise visits revealed what customers actually experienced instead of what leadership wanted him to see. Over time, those unannounced inspections became less frequent, partly because the company had grown too large to visit regularly, and partly because trusted executives assured him every location was exceeding expectations. Employees gradually began believing those surprise visits had become nothing more than stories told during training sessions. They assumed corporate headquarters would always notify managers before Richard Lawson ever stepped inside one of his own buildings. That assumption would become the biggest mistake many of them would ever make. Then, on one ordinary afternoon that looked no different from hundreds before it, Richard made a decision that nobody inside the executive offices knew about. He instructed his driver to take a different route. He left his assistants behind. His security team never accompanied him. He placed no phone calls to regional management. No emails were sent. No executive announced that the founder was on his way. He wanted to experience the VIP lounge exactly as every guest experienced it, without special treatment, prepared greetings, or carefully staged hospitality. He wanted the truth. What he found waiting inside would expose failures stretching back several years. Failures that had quietly grown larger every month because everyone responsible believed nobody important would ever notice. The rotten meal was only the beginning. Why had no employee reacted when it was served? Why did several staff members suddenly avoid looking in Richard Lawson's direction the moment they realized who he was? Who had convinced an entire management team that hiding problems was easier than fixing them? And why would an investigation into a single lunch eventually cost dozens of people their careers? Richard didn't yet know the answers, but before he finished that afternoon, every comfortable assumption inside the company was about to be challenged. Richard Lawson had trained himself over the years to notice the details most people overlooked. Before the first plate ever reached his table, he had already begun forming questions in his mind. The VIP lounge looked impressive from a distance, exactly as the company brochures promised, with polished marble floors, soft lighting, leather seating, and artwork carefully selected to reflect luxury. But appearances can be carefully maintained while standards quietly disappear. As Richard settled into his seat, his eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in every corner without attracting attention. A thin layer of dust rested along the edge of an expensive wooden display cabinet, something that should never have happened in a lounge that claimed to serve the nation's most influential travelers. Several serving stations stood completely empty even though the afternoon rush had already begun. Small nameplates identified premium dishes that were nowhere to be found, leaving only empty trays and serving utensils behind. A guest standing near one station looked confused before quietly returning to his seat without saying a word. Another couple exchanged disappointed glances after searching for fresh fruit that had clearly not been replaced for some time. These weren't major failures by themselves, but together they painted a picture Richard knew all too well. Excellence doesn't disappear overnight. It fades one ignored decision at a time. As he continued observing the room, something else became impossible to ignore. Employees were moving quickly, yet very little seemed to be getting accomplished. Several attendants walked past waiting guests without acknowledging them. A supervisor glanced toward Richard's table before immediately looking away and pretending to organize paperwork that didn't seem to require immediate attention. Two managers emerged briefly from a nearby office, whispered to one another with concerned expressions, and disappeared again before either approached the dining area. Even guests who appeared accustomed to luxury service were beginning to show signs of frustration. One businessman checked his watch repeatedly while waiting for a refill that never arrived. Another quietly pushed aside an unfinished plate after noticing the food had gone cold. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody created a scene. But disappointment filled the room in ways that couldn't be measured by customer surveys or corporate reports. Richard had seen this atmosphere before in struggling businesses. Employees weren't working with confidence. They were working with uncertainty, constantly reacting instead of staying prepared. Somewhere inside this operation, leadership had stopped leading. Then his meal finally arrived. At first glance, everything looked exactly as it should. The presentation was elegant. The steak rested neatly beside seasoned vegetables. A carefully arranged garnish completed the plate, and the server placed a glass of premium wine beside it with practiced precision before quietly walking away. Anyone taking a quick photograph would have believed the meal belonged on the cover of a luxury travel magazine. But Richard had spent enough years around professional kitchens to know presentation alone meant very little. The moment he leaned forward, an unpleasant odor reached him before the food ever touched his lips. It wasn't subtle. It was the unmistakable smell of meat that should never have left the kitchen. He cut into it slowly, noticing an unusual texture beneath the knife. The vegetables had already begun losing their freshness, their appearance disguising flavors that had long since faded. The wine, advertised as carefully temperature-controlled, felt noticeably warm in his hand. Every detail confirmed the same troubling conclusion. Someone inside this lounge had decided appearances mattered more than quality. Most guests would have immediately complained or demanded another meal. Richard Lawson didn't either. He placed his fork back onto the table with remarkable calm and remained completely silent. His attention shifted away from the plate and toward the people surrounding him. This moment would tell him far more than the spoiled food ever could. He watched nearby employees continue serving other tables as though nothing unusual had happened. One attendant looked directly at the untouched meal before quickly turning away. Another employee slowed briefly while passing Richard's table but continued walking without asking if everything was satisfactory. Across the room, a manager noticed Richard sitting quietly, paused for only a second, then disappeared behind an office door without saying a single word. Minutes passed. Nobody returned. Nobody apologized. Nobody offered to replace the meal or investigate the problem. The silence became impossible to ignore. It was almost as if everyone understood exactly what had happened, but hoped the quiet guest in the corner would simply finish his drink, pay the bill, and leave before asking any difficult questions. That reaction disturbed Richard far more than the rotten food itself because it suggested this wasn't an isolated mistake. It suggested familiarity. Without raising his voice or revealing frustration, Richard calmly stood from his chair and asked a nearby employee a simple question. He requested permission to see the kitchen. The employee hesitated, clearly caught off guard, before nervously looking toward the manager's office instead of answering directly. That single glance confirmed Richard's growing suspicion that something much larger was being hidden. Moments later, the heavy swinging doors opened, and Richard Lawson stepped into the kitchen that carried his company's name. What waited on the other side would erase any remaining doubt that this was merely one bad meal. Behind those doors, he would find evidence that would transform a disappointing lunch into one of the largest internal investigations in the company's history. The moment Richard Lawson stepped through the swinging kitchen doors, the atmosphere changed completely. Conversations that had filled the room only seconds earlier came to an abrupt stop. Several employees lowered their heads without being asked. Others suddenly became busy with tasks they had ignored moments before. The confidence they displayed while serving guests had vanished, replaced by expressions that suggested they understood exactly why he was there. Richard didn't raise his voice or accuse anyone of wrongdoing. Years of building a successful company had taught him that the first explanations offered during a crisis were rarely the complete truth. People under pressure often focused more on protecting themselves than revealing what had actually happened. Instead of reacting emotionally, he quietly introduced himself to those who didn't immediately recognize him and asked the simplest question possible. "Can someone explain how this meal reached my table?" The room remained silent for several long seconds before a kitchen supervisor finally stepped forward with an answer that sounded carefully rehearsed. He blamed an inexperienced cook who had supposedly overlooked standard quality checks during a particularly busy afternoon. The explanation seemed convenient, but Richard noticed something important. Before speaking, the supervisor looked toward the general manager, almost as if waiting for silent approval. That brief glance suggested the answer had less to do with facts and more to do with protecting someone higher up the chain of command. Richard continued asking calm, straightforward questions, allowing each person to tell their version of events without interruption. The kitchen supervisor insisted the problem began with a careless cook. The cook, visibly nervous, admitted preparing the meal but explained that every ingredient had already been approved before reaching the kitchen. According to him, the food arrived from storage exactly as it had been delivered earlier that morning. When Richard asked who was responsible for checking freshness before service began, another employee pointed toward the inventory manager. The inventory manager immediately shifted responsibility to outside suppliers, insisting deliveries had become increasingly unreliable over recent months despite repeated complaints. Yet when Richard quietly requested delivery documentation and purchasing records, Another inconsistency appeared almost immediately. Every supplier listed on the invoices had consistently received excellent performance ratings from the company. None had reported quality issues. Several had even supplied Richard's other properties during the same week without receiving a single complaint. Something wasn't adding up. If the suppliers had delivered fresh products elsewhere, why was only this lounge serving spoiled food? The excuses were beginning to contradict one another, and Richard could see confidence disappearing from the faces around him as each new answer created another unanswered question. Within the hour, Richard contacted the company's internal compliance division and instructed them to begin an immediate review of the property's operating records. What appeared at first to be a routine inspection quickly became something much larger. Cleaning schedules requested from the management office couldn't be located. Employees searched filing cabinets, computer systems, and storage rooms, yet documents that should have been available within minutes had somehow disappeared. One manager claimed the records had recently been archived. Another insisted the files had accidentally been misplaced during an office reorganization. Neither explanation satisfied investigators who understood that sanitation records were among the most important documents any food service operation was required to maintain. The missing paperwork raised a troubling possibility. Records weren't simply disorganized. They may have been intentionally removed because someone feared what they would reveal. Richard remained remarkably composed, but each missing document strengthened his belief that the spoiled meal had merely exposed a much deeper problem hidden beneath years of polished presentations and impressive financial reports. The investigation expanded rapidly as inspectors examined refrigeration systems, storage procedures, and digital monitoring equipment. Temperature logs that should have documented food safety every few hours contained unexplained gaps stretching across entire days. Several entries appeared to have been completed using identical handwriting despite supposedly being recorded by different employees working separate shifts. Electronic records failed to match handwritten reports, and timestamps revealed that some inspections had been entered long after the workday had already ended. Even more concerning, health inspection reports contained signatures that looked nearly identical week after week, raising immediate questions about whether required inspections had actually taken place when management claimed they had. Specialists comparing the documents concluded that multiple records appeared to have been copied rather than completed independently. Richard had spent years insisting that honesty mattered more than perfection because honest mistakes could always be corrected. False records, however, represented deliberate choices. Someone hadn't simply failed to follow company policy. Someone had invested considerable effort into making failure appear invisible. Then investigators uncovered the piece of evidence that changed everything. Security footage stored deep within the property's surveillance system revealed a pattern no one expected to find. On multiple occasions over several months, employees could be seen quietly removing expired meat, spoiled produce, and outdated dairy products from refrigerators only minutes before scheduled health inspections or executive visits. Fresh replacements were hurriedly placed on shelves while inspectors walked through spotless kitchens that reflected a carefully manufactured image of excellence. Once the inspections ended, purchasing records suggested the same cycle began all over again. It wasn't one careless employee making isolated mistakes. It was a coordinated routine that depended on everyone remaining silent. Managers knew. Supervisors knew. Some employees appeared uncomfortable, but they followed instructions because challenging leadership often carried consequences they couldn't afford. Richard watched the footage without speaking, recognizing that every clip represented another day customers had unknowingly trusted a system that had quietly abandoned the standards his company was built upon. The investigation was no longer about a rotten meal served inside a VIP lounge. It had become the discovery of a workplace where appearances mattered more than integrity, where reports replaced accountability, and where deception had gradually become part of everyday operations. The people responsible had convinced themselves they would never be exposed because they believed Richard Lawson would never again walk through those doors without warning. They were wrong, and the evidence now sitting before investigators would soon force every person involved to answer for decisions that had been hidden for far too long. By the time the initial review of the kitchen was complete, Richard Lawson no longer needed theories. He needed proof that would withstand every question, every legal review, in every attempt to shift responsibility. He refused to make emotional decisions based solely on what he had witnessed that afternoon, no matter how disturbing it had been. Instead, he contacted an independent auditing firm that had never worked with his company before and instructed them to examine every aspect of the VIP lounge's operation without informing local management what they were specifically looking for. Richard wanted complete transparency. If the failures extended beyond the kitchen, he intended to uncover every one of them. Within hours, investigators arrived carrying years of experience in hospitality compliance, food safety, corporate governance, and financial oversight. They weren't interested in polished presentations or carefully prepared explanations. Every department was examined from the ground up. Purchasing records were compared against inventory reports. Employee schedules were matched with digital access logs. Maintenance reports were reviewed alongside surveillance footage. Customer complaints that had been quietly closed months earlier were reopened and studied again. What initially appeared to be a disappointing dining experience quickly expanded into one of the most comprehensive internal investigations the company had ever conducted. Richard remained nearby throughout the process, saying very little while watching a business he had spent his entire adult life building slowly reveal truths that had remained hidden beneath years of impressive performance reports. As investigators continued connecting one piece of evidence to another, the picture became impossible to ignore. Food safety reports that management proudly presented during inspections had been altered long before regulators ever saw them. Required temperature checks had been entered after the fact instead of being recorded in real time. Cleaning schedules had been completed on paper despite surveillance footage showing areas left unattended for hours. Health and sanitation records contained information copied repeatedly from previous weeks rather than documenting actual inspections. What troubled investigators most was that these were not isolated incidents committed by one dishonest employee. Similar patterns appeared across multiple departments, suggesting the failures had become embedded in the daily operation of the lounge itself. Managers had received complaints from staff members concerned about refrigeration problems, aging storage equipment, inconsistent food rotation, and declining service standards. Internal emails showed maintenance requests being delayed month after month, because replacing equipment would reduce quarterly profits. Employees responsible for food preparation had documented concerns about spoiled inventory arriving from internal storage, yet those warnings disappeared into management files without meaningful action. Every overlooked complaint became another link in a chain of decisions that slowly pushed company standards further away from the values Richard Lawson had established years earlier. The audit uncovered another disturbing reality. Several current and former employees agreed to confidential interviews after investigators guaranteed their statements would remain protected. One after another, they described the same workplace culture. Staff members who questioned food quality or reported safety concerns were often reminded to remain loyal to management instead of creating unnecessary problems. Some were transferred to less desirable shifts after raising repeated concerns. Others stopped reporting issues altogether because they believed nothing would change. New employees quickly learned that asking too many questions could damage future promotions, while experienced workers quietly accepted practices they once would have challenged. Over time, silence became the safest option. Excellence was no longer rewarded. Keeping problems out of executive reports became the priority. The luxury image presented to premium guests remained flawless, while the operation behind the dining room gradually moved further away from the standards customers believed they were paying for. Richard listened carefully to every interview transcript. None of the employees described one dramatic event that changed the company overnight. Instead, they described years of small compromises that accumulated until unacceptable practices became ordinary. It was a painful realization for a founder who had always believed culture was a company's greatest asset. Customer records confirmed what Richard feared most. Premium guests had unknowingly received meals that never should have been served, while complaints submitted through customer service channels were frequently rewritten before reaching corporate headquarters. Some reports describing poor food quality had been categorized as isolated service issues. Others disappeared entirely after local managers claimed the situations had been resolved. Financial performance remained strong because the lounge continued attracting high-profile travelers. many of whom assumed an occasional disappointing experience was simply bad luck rather than evidence of a deeper operational failure. The prestige of the company's name had protected the location from closer scrutiny for far too long. Success had created confidence. Confidence had created complacency, and complacency had allowed accountability to quietly disappear. The VIP lounge continued generating impressive revenue, encouraging leadership at the local level to believe strong financial results mattered more than maintaining the standards that had built the brand in the first place. They became convinced that reputation alone would continue carrying the business forward, regardless of what happened inside the kitchen or behind office doors. Everything changed the moment the one customer they never expected chose to visit without warning. Richard Lawson hadn't arrived as a chairman inspecting his investment. He had arrived as an ordinary guest expecting the same experience promised to every client. The moment he tasted that rotten meal, years of carefully hidden failures finally collided with the one person capable of exposing all of them. When the independent audit concluded, Richard gathered senior corporate leadership and reviewed every finding in detail. There was no heated argument, no dramatic confrontation, and no opportunity for lengthy excuses. The evidence spoke more clearly than any explanation ever could. False reports, ignored complaints, manipulated records, neglected equipment, and a culture that discouraged honesty had destroyed the foundation on which trust depended. Richard understood that the real damage had not been caused by one spoiled steak served on one afternoon. That meal had merely uncovered what had already been happening for years. The true failure was that customers placed their confidence in the company's name, while employees entrusted with protecting that reputation slowly abandoned the principles that made it valuable. Within hours, termination notices were issued to multiple members of the local leadership team, including managers whose decisions had allowed deception to replace accountability. Others were placed on immediate administrative leave pending additional review. These actions were not taken to satisfy public opinion or create the appearance of decisive leadership. They were taken because trust inside the organization had completely collapsed. Richard Lawson knew that once integrity disappears from a company, every promise made to customers becomes meaningless until that integrity is restored. The investigation had reached its most painful conclusion, but the hardest decision of all was still waiting, because rebuilding a broken culture would demand far more than replacing the people who had allowed it to happen. By sunrise the following morning, the atmosphere inside the VIP lounge was almost unrecognizable. The dining room that had welcomed executives, celebrities, and business leaders only a day earlier sat completely empty, its doors temporarily closed while inspectors continued their work. The kitchen had been shut down until every piece of equipment, every storage room, and every preparation area met the standards Richard Lawson had demanded since the day he founded the company. Refrigerators were emptied, inventory was discarded, and every remaining ingredient was inspected one item at a time. Purchasing contracts were suspended pending further review, and every supplier connected to the property was required to prove that products leaving their facilities had met every safety requirement before arriving at the lounge. Richard understood that rebuilding confidence required more than replacing spoiled food. Every link in the process had to earn back the trust that had been lost. Customers would eventually return, but only if they believed the company had chosen accountability over convenience. Inside corporate headquarters, news of the investigation spread quickly. Employees across the country followed each update with growing disbelief, realizing that one unannounced visit by the founder had exposed years of decisions nobody thought would ever come to light. Before the morning was over, the entire local management team had been removed from their positions. The decision was neither rushed nor emotional. Every termination was supported by documented evidence gathered during the independent audit. Those responsible for altering records, ignoring repeated warnings, or allowing unsafe practices to continue were no longer entrusted with representing Richard Lawson's company. Experienced leaders from other locations were temporarily assigned to stabilize operations while a permanent leadership team was assembled. Yet what happened next surprised many of the remaining employees far more than the dismissals themselves. Richard did not spend the day congratulating investigators or discussing financial losses. Instead, he requested private meetings with cooks, servers, cleaners, maintenance workers, and junior staff members whose concerns had been overlooked for months. One by one, they shared stories they had been afraid to tell. They described maintenance requests that disappeared without approval, refrigeration units that repeatedly failed, supplies that should have been discarded but remained in storage, and occasions when speaking honestly had been treated as creating unnecessary problems. For the first time in a long time, those employees felt someone was listening not because another crisis had occurred, but because their voices genuinely mattered. Richard realized that rebuilding the business would begin with restoring the confidence of the people who had wanted to do the right thing all along. When every interview had been completed and the final reports placed on the conference table, Richard Lawson gathered the remaining employees inside the lounge that had become the center of the company's most painful lesson. The room was silent as everyone waited to hear the man whose name appeared on every building they worked in. There was no anger in his voice and no satisfaction over the difficult decisions that had already been made. He looked around the room at people who were uncertain about the future and reminded them why the company had existed in the first place. He explained that businesses rarely collapse because of a single mistake. Honest mistakes can be corrected, lessons can be learned, and systems can be improved. Companies begin to fail when people convince themselves that standards no longer matter, when shortcuts become accepted, when reports become more important than reality, and when protecting reputations replaces protecting customers. He told them that every guest who walked through those doors placed trust in the company's name long before tasting a single meal, and that trust carried a responsibility no financial report could ever measure. The rotten plate served the previous afternoon had not destroyed the company's reputation. It had exposed the opportunity to save it before millions of customers gradually lost confidence without anyone understanding why. As operations slowly resumed in the weeks that followed, the changes reached far beyond one VIP lounge. Food safety procedures were strengthened across every property. Surprise inspections became routine once again. Customer complaints were sent directly to independent compliance officers instead of remaining solely in local offices. Employees received confidential reporting channels that protected anyone raising legitimate concerns. Performance reviews began rewarding honesty and accountability as much as financial results. Richard Lawson wanted every person wearing the company's uniform to understand that excellence was never achieved by pretending problems did not exist. It was achieved by confronting them before customers paid the price. Looking back, many people would remember the story as the day a billionaire was served rotten food inside his own executive lounge. Richard remembered it differently. He remembered it as the day one forgotten standard nearly cost an entire company everything it had spent decades earning. Sometimes the greatest danger facing a successful business is not the mistake customers can immediately see. It is the behavior quietly accepted behind closed doors until it becomes normal. And in the end, one untouched plate sitting alone on an elegant dining table became more than evidence in an investigation. It became a lasting reminder that reputations are built through countless small decisions, but they can begin to disappear the moment people stop believing that doing the right thing still matters. One meal exposed the truth. One decision restored accountability. And one unexpected visit changed the future of an entire company forever.